So our guest today is Phanish Puranam, the Roland Berger Shared Professor of Strategy and Organizational Design at INSEAD. He earned his doctorate in management at the Wharton School. He arrived there a few years after I left. His dissertation topic was about grafting innovation, working with his chair, Harbir Singh, looking at how what happens when entrepreneurial firms get acquired by established firms. He has served for, I think, 9 years as a senior editor at Organization Science, has been a special issue co-editor at SMJ, serves on numerous editorial boards, has published numerous papers, literally dozens, and has accumulated over 8,000 Google Scholar citations, a mark that I hope to catch up to someday. And studies how organizations work and how we can make them work better, the links between strategy and organization, and the use of formal models and experiments to study organizations. So please join me in welcoming Phanish Puranam. Yeah, okay. You can hear some of the claps maybe, but most people are muted. So Phanish, thank you very much for joining us today. We really appreciate it. Let me just, I just need to stop the screen share and rearrange my my windows for a moment. Good, okay. So I always like to start out these discussions by saying, you know, I've never yet seen the 10-year-old who says, "Mommy, I really want to be a strategy professor when I grow up." Those words, I think, have never been spoken by a 10-year-old ever. And so I generally assume that most of us have gotten to this profession through some kind of indirect method. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about what that path was for you that led you to this profession. I know you were a civil engineering student as an undergraduate. So kind of maybe another way of phrasing my question is, you know, what's a nice civil engineer like you doing in a crazy field like this?
Thank you, Rich. So the story, I guess, goes back to my parents because both of them are academics. And it's not a coincidence, I think, that both me and my brother ended up as academics. My younger brother is also a business school professor. He's at USC in marketing.
Wow.
And in fact, my dad, he's in marketing.
He's in marketing, okay.
He's much younger, so he just joined the field quite recently. But maybe the other point of contact with your group is that my dad's actually an alumnus of Purdue. He got his PhD at Purdue in engineering school.
Oh, okay.
So he's particularly, by the way, very, very pleased to hear that you guys invited me out here today. So
wonderful. Well, why isn't he joining us?
I did consider it. I suspect he's heard my life story. So that may be one. But so both him and my mother are academics, so they are professors. And my brother and I kind of grew up in a household where there were doctoral students around all the time, right? We had like
what were your parents' fields? What were their fields of study?
Dad is a professor of engineering and mom is a professor of molecular biology.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So they had a lot of research students working with them all the time in these domains. So I kind of knew that I wanted to be in research, but I thought it was going to be in engineering.
Okay.
And then during my undergrad engineering program, I still thought it was going to be engineering. I was very lucky to come across a copy of Simon's Sciences of the Artificial. So it was an assigned reading in some course, and it was kind of maybe even an optional reading. And by some stroke of good fortune, I took the trouble to read it. And it got me thinking about organizations and social systems the way an engineer would. And that was kind of an idea in the back of my mind, but it did not really go anywhere on its own. I actually graduated and worked in an engineering consulting company for a year. And that's when it hit me that the moment you become somewhat senior in engineering consulting firm, you stop doing engineering and you start doing management.
Right.
So there isn't that much engineering going on beyond the first couple of years. After that, mostly it's managing contractors, managing turnkey systems, you know, and dealing with contracts, a lot of the kind of stuff that Fabrice works on, for example. So it became quite clear to me that managing people is interesting, but it's actually possible to think of it the way an engineer would. which might be different from the way non-engineers might.
Yeah, tell us
So,
about that difference. What do you see as those differences?
I think engineers tend to look at systems, right? So they tend to see systems as composed of many interacting parts. So it comes quite naturally for engineers to think about decomposition, interaction, hierarchical clustering, dynamics. So I didn't have even the vocabulary to translate any of these things into social domains at that time. But there was something about the intuition of thinking about human systems in this way that I found quite appealing. And Simon's book was, I think, extremely influential in making me think there must be more here. But this wasn't very well articulated in my head. All I knew was it sounds like there could be something interesting to do here. What does a field of research in such a domain look like? And then at some point, there was a conference in India of management researchers. And this was actually like an AOM offshoot or something. I don't remember the details now anymore. But I ended up going to some sessions, and that's when I got hooked. Because then I realized that these guys were actually working on the kind of problems I was suspecting could be dealt with the way an engineer would. And they were. They were measuring things, they had regressions, they had graphs, they had numbers. So I thought, yeah, I can do this. This looks interesting. So at that point, I think it became kind of clear that I should start looking into getting a PhD in management. So this was, I think, around 2 years after my undergrad. Roughly, this would be the time frame. And I was still pretty clueless because my assumption was the way to do that is you first get an MBA, which is clearly not the way you would recommend doing it now. But that's what I thought. So I ended up doing an MBA degree in India. But it was clear the day I joined the program that I wanted to end up going into a PhD program afterwards. And that's what I did.
What a story. So do you, so you had no regrets at all about leaving engineering. You just, you saw this and it was something that was really attractive to you and great, let me jump into it.
Absolutely. It was very clear to me that this stuff was interesting. And second, I think maybe doing research in engineering would have been interesting. Mm-hmm. I didn't consider that path in any great depth, to be honest. What I did think of was simply taking my training as an engineer and applying it to research in social systems. Right. But I didn't really think about the counterfactual, which might have been to be an engineering professor, like my dad. What I did think of, by the way, was quite seriously, I did consider becoming a musician. That was my other career path, which I was quite serious about for a while.
Okay, what do you play?
So my family also is connected to Indian classical music. So on my maternal grandparents' side, they're all professional musicians. So I grew up learning music, and I was moderately good at it. And at some point, I did seriously think about going professional and making that my career. But it's a very competitive field, and what I figured. Sorry.
I said, sure, of course, it's very competitive. Much lower barriers to entry.
Exactly. And to make a decent living in that field, you got to be extraordinarily good. Whereas you can make an extraordinary living being decently good in our profession, I think. So, so at some point, that's a pragmatic call, I guess. So.
We benefit from the barriers to entry, I think, very much so. Yes.
We do.
That's
people know so little about what it takes to get into a PhD program and even what's necessary and what's not. In my own case, I didn't realize until I got to Wharton that the 2-year interlude in the MBA program was actually kind of unnecessary.
Okay.
I didn't know that, but that was the state of awareness.
So you have, it was not a waste to be an engineer for a while because now you're applying those skills in a different way, right? So tell us a little bit about how it is that you're applying the skills that you learned in engineering in the kinds of projects that you do.
Probably the most practical thing I've always been able to apply is just programming skills. So as an engineer, the one thing that you do learn how to do is code. And I've been using that skill, I think, almost without pause for the entire 20 years I've been in this profession. Nowadays, in fact, more than before. But that's been like one common thing. But beyond that, I think it's not so much a particular engineering, discipline or a set of ideas or theorems or frameworks. It's a particular way of thinking. And the way of thinking is you think really in aggregation terms. You try to understand complex systems as the aggregation of simpler systems. Mm-hmm. You try to think in terms of interaction, decomposition, dynamics. So that mindset, I think, is probably the thing that's consistently followed me in the work I've done. More practically, it's the programming.
Right. So why Wharton? What attracted you specifically to Wharton? I imagine you probably you know, would have been had many opportunities for different PhD programs. Why Wharton specifically?
Oh, because I heard about this amazing alumnus called Rich Makadok.
Now I know you're lying.
No, so the reality is, and this is going to reveal again how completely clueless I was. So Wharton had just made it to the global MBA rankings.
Okay.
Right. So it became very popular in India. And the dean, I think at that time it was Thomas Garrity, if I remember correctly.
Okay.
So he had visited India and gave some interviews with a bunch of senior corporate CEO type folks in India. So he was in the news. And in my mind, there was a strong correlation between being a top MBA program and the place to get your PhD, which again, now I know better, right? I mean,
well, you know, fortunately, Wharton happens to, in that case, it happens to be true. It's not necessarily true in every place, you know?
Exactly. So I just lucked out, I guess. So I landed in a good place without realizing it was as good as it actually was.
Good. So your topic again was the you know, this process of what happens when startups basically get acquired, right? And so tell us a little bit about how you the process that you went through to find that topic and what was interesting to you about that topic.
So going in, as I mentioned, I was very interested in organizations right from the beginning, right? And I think all of us took that sequence with, I guess you might have taken it with John Kimberly as well, the one on organizations.
Yeah, so we had to take, I think, 2 OB, 2 OT, and 2 strategy seminars. And in my year, it was the strategy was Harbier and Ned Bowman. And the OT might have been Kimberly.
Okay.
I don't really remember the OT ones. I have to go look it up. The OB was Ken Smith, and who was the other one? I forget. Anyway, but there was we had to take courses in all 3 areas. Yeah,
all 3
areas. You had Kimberly.
I think I had John Kimberly, and I liked what I read in that class, and I ended up doing an independent study with him. But it also became clear to me that the way that people in that field were approaching organizational issues was a bit different from the way a strategy person would. And I think the basic difference was the normative slant that the strategy people bring quite naturally to these questions. So most macro OT people do not, because they come from a sociological background, which is, it's a different tradition. It's more descriptive, I think. And my engineering mindset clearly made the normative approach much more natural to me.
Of course.
So that's always a thing, right? You look at a system and the first question you ask is, how can you make it better? Right. So that was very much the way I wanted to approach this thing. And I started talking with Harbier. And this was probably the other big stroke of luck. I mean, Harbier is an extraordinary mentor. He still is today. I don't make any major career decisions without consulting him, even today. And he always finds the time for me. And I realized in talking to him that M&A integration would be a sweet spot. Because this is a strategy problem. We spend lots of money on this year after year. We often don't get it right. In fact, more often than not, we don't get it right.
Right.
And there's this very strong intuition on the street that part of the reason we don't get it right might be overpaying, but the other significant part might be the organizational complexity of actually putting the resources together and making it work. Right. So if you want to study organization design in a context where there are huge dollar bills attached to the consequences, that's post-merger integration, right? That was very, and once that was clear, then we started hunting for context. And I think completely by chance, one of Harbier's former students, MBA students, who was out in the Valley, I think this guy was at Symantec, he used to head corporate development at Symantec. He reached out to him saying, Cisco's doing some amazing stuff on M&A. None of us seem to be able to figure out how to do it. They're doing it very well. Could you help us figure this out? So Harbier and I got on a plane. We went and did a bunch of interviews. We talked to people. And pretty soon I realized this was what I wanted to study. So what's the difference between successful and unsuccessful acquirers in terms of how they manage post-merger integration? So very phenomenon-driven question. There wasn't like a strong theory-driven entry into the problem. But once I had figured out that was the phenomenon I wanted to explain, there was, of course, a lot of prior theory one could go back and draw on. And that's how the topic kind of got formulated. And I should mention Maurizio Zolo. You might have overlapped with him a little bit.
Sure, I knew Maurizio, yes.
So he was just wrapping up, and he had done work on post-merger integration in a different sense. What he was looking at was post-merger integration as a process. And he was interested in showing that if there are opportunities to get better at it by repetition, this is going to show up in the quality and the outcomes of integration. And he had just shown this data from Bank One. So my take was slightly different. It wasn't on the process of integration as much as the strategic decisions on what to integrate and how to integrate. But he was a very useful sounding board to get me started thinking about this question. So we even had one project in common between Harbir, Maurizio, and me, which kind of launched me down this path. But then that became the topic for my dissertation.
Right, that's a very fortunate connection. I was going to ask you about the industry connection. Tell me a little bit more about that, how that came to be, and because it seems like that was the big inspiration, that once you guys had saw what was going on, that seemed to inspire you. So tell me a little bit about how that happened and what the experience was like for you.
So this was really, it was my good fortune that Harbir was my advisor, and it is Harbir's not fortune but strategy to be very well connected to what's going on in practice. Right. That's one thing that he's always done very, very well. And I think because he's so well liked by his MBA students, they kind of keep in touch and tell him what's hot and exciting in their field. And that's a terrific way for an academic, I think, to keep track of what's going on. So this is how it happened. So one of them reached out to him and said, we have this problem of trying to buy startups, but nobody wants to stay after we bought them. The founder gets rich and wants to go sail his yacht, and the rest is working for a large company. So how is it Cisco manages to do it? So it was a very practical problem that he brought to the table. And then Harbir being Harbir could make the bridge between that and the theory angle and the M&A literature. So it worked out very well for me. I was a beneficiary. I can't take more credit than that for landing on that problem.
Okay, good. Well, that sounds like a very exciting way to find a dissertation topic. And so you may have already answered this in a sense, but I'll ask it anyway. The one challenge doctoral students sometimes face is they have a topic that they're interested in, but they have trouble kind of narrowing it down to a specific research question that's answerable, right? So how did that go for you in your dissertation work, getting it down to an answerable research question?
So it's a very iterative process, which I think is always the case, right? You have to iterate multiple times between the phenomenon that motivated you, the data that's actually available, the theory that interests you, and I guess your toolkit of methodological skills. So it's kind of this bouncing between these 4 points till you converge. I don't think there was anything particularly unusual in my convergence process, apart from the fact that it was very fast. And it was fast not because I think I was faster in each step, because the doors were always open. So I mentioned Harbir already many times, but in fact, Dan Leventhal and Sid Winter played just as important a role. So these guys were my committee, and as well as Gabriel Zulansky and Joel Waldfogel. So in particular, Dan, Harbir, and Sid, they had an open door policy. So you could walk in as often as you like. They must have seen at least 4 or 5 drafts of the 5-page version of this is what I want to do with my thesis. Right. And they would get back on feedback relatively quickly. So it's also possible I caught these guys at a life stage where they had much more time. I'm not sure, they all got like very serious and very important later, but at the time I was a student, at least all these gentlemen had plenty of time for me. So I benefited a lot from that very rapid iteration. And I think that was how eventually it converged. But I don't think there's a shortcut to that iterative process. Everybody has to go through that.
Okay. Yeah. So were there ways of framing the question that you had to discard through that iterative process? And I guess there must have been, that you initially tried to frame the question this way, but then. So tell us a little bit about that. What were some rejected ways to framing the question that you might have wanted to pursue that you had to reject?
So I'm trying to reconstruct from memory here. So the fact that I had multiple iterations tells you already that there must have been n-1 rejections. So that's a given. I don't remember all of them. The one I do remember, which clearly was a turning point in my thinking, was I think I was framing the problem very normatively. So I was asking really the question, how do we improve post-merger integration? Which is a very natural thing, right? Because that's how the problem landed on our laps, and that's what was interesting and so on. It's my natural tendency as an engineer to think that way. But that was clearly the wrong way to ask the question. So it was this idea that you have to be able to switch between the normative and the descriptive stance on the same problem, right? So rather than ask it as how can we improve it, we could ask what explains variation in successful and less successful outcomes. That immediately turns it into a much more research-friendly question.
Right.
Right. And then it was a series of refinements on that, I think. I don't remember the other details
Yeah.
much.
No, I mean, I think the reason why I said you may have already answered this question is because, you had said that Cisco was clearly doing something different, right? So right away, that's kind of an answerable research question of what is Cisco doing different, right?
Exactly.
So that can, in some cases, you're fortunate to be, for the topic not to be too far distant from the question in cases like that, right?
That's right. But I would underline that point. I think having that either the stylized fact or the stylized puzzle, this is a great asset to have, right? Because it becomes the focal point around which your effort can then be organized. So in my case, the stylized puzzle was, here's an industry where industry leaders are on record saying M&A is not a good idea in tech. There was a widely cited quotation from Andy Grove to that effect circulating in those days. Average success rates are around 50%. It's like flipping it's like flipping a coin, but attached to a very expensive bet, right? And then you have this company which seems to have a success rate upwards of 70%. So something is weird here, right? And that becomes a very focal, energizing question. So that, I think that usually helps.
Yeah, and that could be, that's a nice technique to help doctoral students or anybody really find a research question, which is to say, what's the conventional wisdom in an industry, right? Such as, M&A doesn't work in tech, right? And what are the exceptions to that rule, right? Who's defying the conventional wisdom, right? What's the conventional wisdom and who's defying it and how are they defying it? And that could be either on the upside or the downside, right? The conventional wisdom could be, this is the way to do things, right? But there may be some company out there that does things that way and still is a disaster, something like that, right? So, yeah, that's good. That's an interesting approach to finding a research question. So, what were the biggest challenges for you in doing a dissertation on this topic? What were the challenges you had to overcome?
So my first cut at the problem was inspired by the fact that when I flew to Palo Alto with Harbir and with Maurizio, we did like 15 interviews in 4 days. We had amazing conversations. And I thought, oh, this is going to be super easy to get the data together because people are so excited by this. So I designed this survey and I get back 50 responses.
Okay. Out of how many that you sent out?
I was hoping to get 500. No, I'm not sure this indicates something about the nature of the phenomenon or my naivety, but that was my expectation. I thought 500, I got 50. 50 is not going to work. Yeah. So at this point, there was this huge pivot towards trying to find proxies in the archival data for the things that I had in the survey. And that was like this 3-4 month window, which was very stressful now, I think back to it. But I managed to find reasonable proxies for most things. Not for everything, but for most things. And so I'll tell you very critically the ones that really mattered. So one was obviously the outcome. So these are deals in which there is no cost cutting, right? You don't buy these startups to get rid of headcount. So, and in many cases, there is no revenue attribution possible. Because in many cases, what you bought doesn't have any revenue to begin with. And you cannot allocate the diff and diff on revenue of the acquirer precisely to the particular acquisition they made. But a lot of them were patenting stuff, which meant that you could actually find the names of the inventors in these target companies.
Right.
And then you track forward and see, did these guys continue to be productive later, once they were in the acquired company? So it was like an early exercise in big data from public sources, if you think about it like that, right? So that's what it was. The other thing you could get hold of was this data set called CorpTech. And CorpTech had these huge, directories which would list these tech startups, but interestingly, they would continue to list them after they were acquired. and they would list them differently depending on whether they were left alone as a P&L entity or they were merged. So that gave me my measure of integration, right? Otherwise, getting the post-merger integration outcome on a large sample was very hard to do without a survey. But this was the proxy, and it was not easy to convince people this was good because it was dichotomous, it was from archival sources.
Yeah.
So then I used the 50 surveys, which I did have, to calibrate those with this measure from CorpTech. And with that triangulation and some interviewing, and I think a good deal of faith, we managed to convince people that this is actually not a crazy measure, and it seems to correlate with outcomes the way you would expect it to. So I think that was kind of the major challenge at some point in the thesis, and then once that was overcome, the rest was relatively easier.
Yeah, many a research project has died on the battlefield of survey response rates, low survey response rates.
Exactly.
It's good that you were able to turn lemons into lemonade that way, you know. And yeah, I think there are ways to make surveys work in terms of response rates. But typically, the cover letter saying, "Hey, I'm a doctoral student from Wharton," is not going to do it.
No.
Even from Wharton, right? Or I'm a faculty member from so and so. I remember seeing a research presentation which was based on census data, and the researcher showed the thing that he loved most about census data, and it was a photograph of the envelope that the census survey comes in, and in big letters across the envelope it says, "Your response is required by law." So that's the way to get survey responses. But another way that I've seen used is obviously if you're surveying within an organization, getting buy-in at the top, right? Or if you're surveying across organizations to get the sponsorship of an industry association or something like that, right? So if a survey comes from an industry association, it might be might get a better response rate than if it's just coming from some academic, right?
Absolutely.
But that's good. That's good. So were there any other big challenges other than in terms of getting the data that you faced in the project? Or
No,
was
I
that
think that was the main one. I think once that was over, the rest went through quite fast. So I actually managed to get out of Wharton in about 4 years.
That's amazing.
This is, and I mean, to be honest, there was a reason outside of my work, which had to do with the fact that, so my wife, I mean, we're not married yet at that point. She was in a program in University of Maryland, and we were commuting back and forth, and this was just not a sustainable lifestyle for us. So there was a lot of pressure to just get it done and move ahead, and I think that helped. But I don't think there were any other major hurdles once the data problem had been solved.
Great. So tell us a little bit about the process that you've gone through in moving from the work that you did on the dissertation project to the kind of work that you're doing now. What has been the process, and what have been the big mile markers along the way that that have shifted your thinking or shifted your approach?
So I think coming out of the PhD, I was very much interested in organizational design problems, but very applied to particular empirical contexts like M&A integration or interfirm relationships or joint ventures. If somebody had asked me, I guess I would have abstracted and said, underneath these different phenomena, there are actually very similar underlying principles. So challenges of coordination, challenges of incentives, how hierarchy works. So these are really abstract org design issues. They just manifest differently in different contexts. But I don't think I made that explicit articulation of the common underlying themes until I had to write my third-year statement.
Yeah, that's usually when it happens.
Exactly.
What is it that's connecting all these things? I have to come up with a rationalization for why I'm doing all these different things. Yes.
So this huge ex post rationalization exercise, but guided by some friendly souls among your colleagues and your committee members. And those conversations made me realize that actually what I'm working on are org design problems. They just happen to be embedded in different empirical contexts. And I think by the time I put in my package for tenure, my research statement reads as if it's really an organizational design researcher who happens to be studying different phenomena. Whereas I'm pretty sure my job market statement did not read like that.
Mm-hmm.
So something happened in those 7 years. I can't put my finger on which point, but the third year mark is a pretty good candidate, I think, for that transition.
Okay. So that's where you kind of reframed it. I'm basically doing something at the intersection of strategy and org design. Right? I'm looking at these bigger organizational design principles within the firm and how they connect up to strategy. Right.
Exactly.
So given that that's the way you define your topic area, what do you think are the most important unanswered questions at this point in that particular topic area of the relationship between organization design and strategy? What don't we know about the relationship between organization design and strategy that we really ought to know and we need to find out?
So there are many, but I would say there are two that particularly I find quite central to whatever we do going forward. One is the relationship between formal design choices and the informal organization. So this is like absolutely critical to everything in strategy, such as strategy implementation, for instance, or change management, or post-merger integration, or strategic alliances or reorganizations. So in each of these cases, the common phenomenon is one where there are a few structural levers which people with the decision rights at the top of the hierarchy can wield, but they tend to be fairly coarse instruments. So then some cascading magic has to happen between those choices and then what actually happens on the ground. And it's a very hit or miss process, right? Most of the consulting data tells us that the success rates for any of the phenomena I just listed is around 50%. Mm-hmm. So we are doing on average like flipping coins, right? It's really not much better than that. So there is a whole process in between. And I think if we had better theoretical tools and empirical tools to understand the linkages between formal design choices and what actually happens on the ground, this would be fantastic, not just for org science or org theory, but for strategy, because this is a very practical implementation problem. The good news, I think, is we are closer than ever to solving it because of the data we have now.
Okay.
Right? So this is actually something that I might come back to later if you like as well. One of the positives, and there are very few out of this entire pandemic situation we are in, is that for the first time, we have incredible digital exhaust data on how organizations actually work. Because everything we've been doing has been electronic for the last 4 months.
True.
Right? So there's a complete trail now of interactions, of networks, of communication exchanges, which, in the past we would have had to rely on participant observation or surveys or something like that. Right? Now we're looking at surveys with a response rate of 100%, basically. So that is really going to be a very important game changer, I think, to start thinking about what is the real relationship between abstract organizational design choices, are you grouped by function or by geography, and actual day-to-day interactions. Along the same lines, I think the link between physical design, space, architecture, and what actually happens in the organization is equally important. Because at the end of the day, both the architecture and the org structure, they end up in the same place, which is they shape interactions between people. Right? And we've kind of tended to think about them in a very compartmentalized way, but the reality is they are extremely interlinked. And my favorite example of this is, so our faculty in INSEAD in Fontainebleau are seated by department. In Singapore, we tend to be mixed up because it was a startup, right? So it was very small, so everybody kind of sat next to each other. And then as we grew over time, we retained that pattern of growth. And you can see quite clearly that the interdepartmental collaborations are much stronger in Singapore than they are in Fontainebleau.
Sure, yeah.
Right? And these reinforce each other, obviously, so the causality can run in both directions. But this sort of idea was at best an intuition. Now we are beginning to get data to nail this down. So I think this is really an absolutely exciting and crucial area to be in the near future. The other one I'll mention is the entire question of hierarchy. So I think we've kind of come to a point where we can seriously ask, are there credible alternatives to hierarchy to organize large systems of collaboration? And the clues come from places like open source. They come from places like non-hierarchical firms, so from crowdsourcing. So it's quite clear that these will not generalize everywhere, but I don't think we yet know very precisely when they do and when they do not generalize. And this is, I think, an absolutely important question, again, for strategy implementation, strategy execution, or even just keeping millennials on your workforce.
Right.
So there are things around that as well. So for me, these are the two things that I end up spending a fair amount of time on. And when there's time left, then I also try to think a bit about what will algorithms in general do to the way we organize.
Mm-hmm.
So as tools for organization design, which is obvious, and I'm teaching MBA electives on that. But also as what would organization design look like, where some of the employees are human and some are algorithms?
Mm-hmm.
That's coming. It's not very far away. It used to sound like sci-fi a few years ago, but I don't think that's true anymore. So I think that's probably going to be the next set of issues. But for now, hierarchy and the informal organization are very mainstream bread and butter topics, I think.
Nice. Yeah, those do sound like two really important questions to me too. You mentioned about the pandemic maybe making it possible to study the informal organization more closely because every interaction now leaves an electronic paper trail, at least for this time period until we get back to some semblance of stability. But that's going to require some, to get that data, I imagine would require somebody to have to sign off on sharing that data with you. Do you think that's going to be a challenge to get the data?
It will
I mean,
be.
the
So
data
I think
exists, but how do we get it?
how do we get it? So I thought the best way to figure out how to do it is to experiment on ourselves. So I'm getting this
Ah,
data right now for INSEAD.
okay.
So, and that immediately showed us all the pitfalls, exactly the ones you're mentioning, right? How do we protect confidentiality? So I don't really need to read the emails. I don't even need to know the names of people. All
Right.
I need to know is I need to know where they're physically located, which department they're in, and then I need to know the cross-flow patterns of interactions and so on. So I have a very talented postdoc working with me, Marco Minervini. So
Mm-hmm.
Marco has actually been spending a lot of time the last month studying all the APIs, and we're trying to figure out how to scrape the data. We are designing the data governance policy as we speak. So we are our own test case. If I can't convince my colleagues to share data with me, then there's no chance we can get an
Sure.
external company to do it. So we want to start here.
Sure. Well, and I imagine there might be some companies that are maybe more open to being researched than others. I imagine that like maybe a Google or a Facebook or something like that,
Yes.
they might be more willing to share that data. So good.
There also that's a bit sometimes a bit of a challenge. So like some of the companies you've named, I've worked with their data, their extremely proprietary data. So they're happy for me to run analysis and even use it for my MBA students for my analytics class where they kind of crunch this data. They're much less comfortable with me publishing it.
Oh.
So there are some cases where I've worked with data from a company which is quite rich, and I've done all the analysis for either for a consulting project or for a teaching project. But that last step of getting it to be publishable can sometimes take many years. In fact, the paper I'm going to present today is also data drawn from a company, and they were actually more open than most. But it still took a few years for us to get to a point where we can share publicly who they are. So that remains a bit of a challenge. I agree.
Mm-hmm. Good. Good. Um, so what more generally, what are the lessons that you've learned so far in your career as a researcher? What do you know now that you wish you had known then?
There's so many, I don't know where to start.
Oh, just pick anyone. I don't know.
No, I think the most important thing really is that you have to be very, very uh, able and willing to kill projects.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I think this is hard for everybody, but I think over a period of time you have to develop a certain hardness of spirit towards your own ideas. And since that doesn't come naturally to anybody, we have to find surrogates who will do it for us. So I think it took me a while to create the ecosystem, but I think now we have things like that. We have brown bags, I have like informal seminars where we literally present ideas which are at the 2 pages stage. And you present them in 30 minutes. And if people tell you, or they don't often tell you very explicitly, but you should be able to read between the lines. If it looks like this is not going anywhere, then it's time to kill it then. There is no
Right.
point in continuing down that path for a year and a half and then discovering it. So
Right.
I think the most useful thing I've learned is how to kill projects.
So that is good, and you basically just seek advice from colleagues.
I
Or
do.
do you have any criteria? That's interesting because many years ago I was actually I think I mentioned this in another one of my videos. Um, I was really actually this close to quitting the career and going and becoming a truck driver or something. I don't know. But
Are you serious?
oh yeah, I was.
Yeah.
I had. I think it was right around the time I had gotten a paper rejected after 4 rounds of review over 5 years, and it was like, boy, what am I doing? You know. What saved me is that at that point I decided that I really didn't like doing this empirical work, and I was really much more of a theorist, and that really kind of got me energized. So that's what kept me in. But I was consulting with a career coach at the time because I was trying to figure out, did I want to stay in this career or not? And she asked me, do you have a set of criteria for deciding what projects you're going to commit to? And I had to confess that I didn't. I was flying seat of the pants, just, doing whatever came along. It sounds like the question that you're answering here is related to that, which is, once I've started a project, how do I know, which ones I want to walk away from?
Correct.
So,
I think kind of related to that there has to be this attitude change, I think, at some point, where you don't take people's critiques of your ideas as critiques of you.
yes.
So there is some distance between me and my ideas, and most of my ideas are crap. I'm a wonderful guy, on the other hand. So the ability to tell that distance, I think, is important, and it doesn't come naturally. It takes a while to get there.
Great. So let me see, how many doctoral students have you mentored at this point? I think there's been quite a number, right?
Yes, I've lost track. I think they'll kill me if they hear me say that, but I can reconstruct from memory if you ask me to, but maybe there's something more specific you want me to.
It's probably at least 10 or so, right? So
yeah, much more than that, yeah.
So what's the most important piece of advice that you give to your own doctoral students?
I mean, they've got to enjoy the process. If they're doing this with the outcome in mind, then they're in the wrong profession. The outcomes in our field are all so delayed and so uncertain. If that's an instrumental reason for doing anything, then this is just not making any sense.
Yeah.
Right. So if you're not in love with the idea of doing what we are doing, then you shouldn't be doing it. I think that's probably the more important screen, because, to be honest, our admissions processes have become quite good in most schools, right? Almost nobody we admit is intellectually incapable. Everybody's smart, technically they're all good, they're all hardworking, they're all going to succeed in some walk of life, but not necessarily in this one. And in this one, I think it's the sheer determination and the joy of doing what you're doing that's probably critical. So maybe that's the only thing concretely I can point to.
So just the importance of intrinsic motivation. If you're not intrinsically motivated, go find something else to do.
Exactly. And I think getting used to rejections. I mean, the modal outcome in our life is rejection, right? So that's what you're going to face most of the time. And then developing the mindset that it's never the reviewer's fault, however annoyed you are at that point. It's your fault. You didn't write it clearly enough. So that sort of attitude becomes, I think, very important to survive in this profession. Otherwise, you can get very frustrated very fast.
That is true. You definitely need thick skin. Definitely need thick skin. And definitely need persistence and optimism and the ability to bounce back from setbacks, because there's plenty of them. Right.
That's true. There's a pragmatic thing I also say, which may or may not be of interest to your students. So I do ask students who work with me to specialize to kind of get some basic competence in 2 out of 3. The 3 being large sample econometric analysis. Nowadays, it's machine learning mostly. Experimental work and modeling. So I don't expect all students to do all 3, but they should do at least 2 and be really good at 1. Because I think there are very strong complementarities between these things, both in the way I think and work, but also for their own work. So that's one very practical thing I do kind of insist on.
Are you noticing any trends in the choices that the students make among those 3?
So I think the machine learning thing is the wave is totally upon us. It's just either become like a very basic technology that everybody will use to manage large data sets and extract insight, or to code large data sets from text and things like that. So that's become very critical. I think the identification wave has hit and somewhat ebbed. So it still remains critical, but I think most journals are at the point where if you are a sophisticated user of techniques and you know the limits of how far you can go towards causal inference and you acknowledge them, that's fine. So it's no longer critical to look for that one killer shock or whatever. And which is going to produce exogenated. So
Yeah,
there was a
that's
period.
good because I think a lot of babies have been thrown out with the bathwater.
You're absolutely
Yeah.
right. And there was a year on the academy where I couldn't remember anything from meeting with the candidates apart from I met two 9/11s and one Hurricane Katrina. So that era is fortunately behind us, I think. So.
But first, let's thank Phanish for putting up with our little oddball ritual of the celebrity talk show. We really
Not at all. I
appreciate
felt very honored. Thank you.
Yeah, we really appreciate it.